All right, folks, welcome to Chapter 1. In Chapter 1, we're going to talk about some initial topics that come up in the study of ethics. And so first we're just going to try and define what ethics is and then draw some important distinctions that we're going to use throughout the semester in this class. So first, if we had to define what ethics is, we could say that it's the study of right and wrong, good and bad, related notions like justice, fairness, equality, what people deserve, topics like that. And there are two different approaches to studying these topics. One of the approaches is called descriptive ethics. This isn't the approach that we're going to take in this class, but descriptive ethics is a kind of scientific study that takes a look at how people actually think and how they actually behave when dealing with moral issues and moral ideas. We're not going to be doing any of that in this class. Right? So descriptive ethics is reserved for various branches of science. For instance, a psychologist might be interested in studying how people think about morality. There's a whole branch of psychology called moral psychology. An anthropologist might be interested in studying what people in various cultures think about right and wrong, or what sorts of behaviors or practices or activities they tend to think are right or wrong. We're not going to be doing that sort of thing in this class. Right? We're going to focus on not so much what people think about right and wrong or how people actually behave, but rather we're going to focus on right and wrong themselves. Right? Focus on the things themselves rather than people's ideas about morality. So that takes us to what is commonly called normative ethics. Normative ethics is the study of the principles, rules, or theories that should guide our actions and our judgments, even if they don't always actually do so in practice. In other words, even if most people don't do the right thing, that doesn't mean that the right thing to do isn't still the right thing to do. Right? So the way people actually think and behave is mostly irrelevant to normative ethics. It just doesn't matter. Right? If most people think irrationally, that doesn't mean that we should think irrationally. If most people sometimes do bad things, that doesn't mean that it's okay to do bad things. So normative ethics focuses on rightness and wrongness and how we should be themselves rather than focusing on how people do in fact think and behave. That's the main difference here between these two ways of approaching the study of ethics. All right, so even though we're not going to take the descriptive ethics approach in this class, it's still kind of worthwhile to think about the sort of thing that that gets done in descriptive ethics so that we can distinguish it from what we are going to be doing in our class. So there's been very famous experiments throughout history that have studied how people actually think and behave when presented with moral issues. One of the more famous ones is a study done by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. These are psychologists who did many experiments on how people actually think and behave. And in 1981, they conducted this study where they presented people with the following problem. They presented their experimental subjects who volunteered for the experiment with this problem. And this is what the problem is. Imagine that the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequences of the programs are as follows. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. All right, so which option is the better option? Which option should we choose? All right, so most people end up saying that program A is the correct response to this problem. All right, in the second half of the experiment, a second group of experimental participants were given the identical problem that we just saw on the last slide, except the programs that they could choose from were programs C and D. Program C, if it's adopted, means that 400 people will die. And if program D is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Okay? So what do most people choose when presented with the options program C and program D? Well, most people end up choosing program D when presented with these two options. All right, so what does this tell us about how we actually make moral judgments? Well, if it's true that most people think program A should be adopted in the first version of the experiment, but then in the second version, most people think program D should be adopted, that shows a kind of problem in the way most people make moral judgments. It seems to reveal that most people make moral judgments in an inconsistent way. Right? Because program A is actually identical to program C, and program B is identical to program D. Of course, nobody wanted program B, or most people didn't, whereas most people wanted program D. Right? So the psychologists concluded that what this shows is that our moral judgments are influenced by what are called framing effects, or the way in which the solutions to a problem are presented to us. The wording of the solution, we might say, how they're framed or phrased. Right? But in reality, how a solution to a problem is phrased or framed shouldn't impact what our judgment should be about that solution. If it's a good solution, it's a good solution. It doesn't really matter how it's framed. Right, so this is a disconcerting implication because it seems to suggest that our moral judgments can be pushed and pulled around by irrelevant factors that have nothing to do with whether the solution to the problem is a good idea. All right, so what we saw in the last few slides was an example of a scientific study that takes a look at how we actually think when dealing with a moral issue where lives are at stake, people could be saved, people could possibly die. There's a ton of science of our moral thinking, and lots of different areas in science that take a look at how people actually think about moral issues. It can be incredibly valuable to take a look at those studies because they can inform our view of how people actually think when dealing with moral issues. And that can kind of help us to theorize about how we should think. It can help us to notice problems in our moral thinking or ways in which our thinking is irrational or inconsistent. In this class, again, as I said already, we're going to set aside the science of moral thinking and focus rather on right and wrong themselves. Okay, so we're going to be asking questions of the form like, what should we do? How should we think? Rather than questions about how do we actually think and behave. All right, so when we're focused on normative ethics, it's important to draw a distinction between two different kinds of question. First kind of question is what's called a value question. And a value question is just a question about what sorts of things, objects or activities, are good or valuable or worthwhile. Typically in ethics, there's a distinction drawn between two kinds of value. First kind is called instrumental value, and the second is called intrinsic value. And here's the difference. A thing has instrumental value just in case it's valuable as a means to achieving something else. Right? So think about like the value attached to working out. Maybe you enjoy going to the rec center and working out. Now, that is an activity that can have value, but it's not valuable for its own sake. It's not like if you didn't get anything out of it that you would still do it. Right? It's valuable as a means. So suppose Samantha goes to the rec center to work out because she wants to get stronger. Or maybe she wants to reduce her anxiety levels. Or maybe she wants to lose weight. There's lots of reasons that people have for working out or exercising. The fact that people have reasons or they have like a goal in mind when they engage in this kind of activity suggests that the activity itself isn't valuable for its own sake. If you didn't get any gains from it, you would no longer do it. Right? So it's valuable in an instrumental way. It's valuable as a means to achieving something else. Better fitness, reduced anxiety levels, whatever the goal may be. All right, we can contrast that kind of value, instrumental value, with what's sometimes called intrinsic value or inherent value. So this is a kind of value that a thing has for its own sake, not because it can be used in a certain kind of way to achieve some other goal. Something that's intrinsically valuable is the goal itself. Right? So take a different kind of activity from exercising. Take an activity like going to the beach with family and friends and just enjoying oneself at the beach. Right? So we can ask, well, what's the point or purpose of doing that? Right? You might say, well, when you do that sort of thing, it makes you happy. It makes you feel happy when you're at the beach with friends and family, just relaxing, enjoying yourself. Right? Now, if we ask the question, well, yeah, but what kind of value does happiness have? Is happiness valuable as a means to achieving something else? Or is happiness the end goal of the activity in this case? And it seems totally reasonable to say happiness just is the goal of the activity. Happiness has intrinsic value. Right? We don't want to be happy for the sake of achieving something else. That is the thing that we want out of the activity. So whereas happiness has intrinsic value, something like exercise would just have merely instrumental value. Right? And there's lots of other examples that we could look at. It's a very deep question in ethics. What other sorts of things might have intrinsic value aside from just happiness? Maybe something like acquiring knowledge might be another good example of something that's intrinsically valuable. Or maybe other people are intrinsically valuable. Think about like the people you love. If you have a family member that you love, you can imagine that person right now and then ask the question, well, are they valuable to you just because you can use them in various ways to achieve some goals that you have? I mean, that just kind of sounds like manipulating a person if you're viewing them in this way, viewing them as useful to help you achieve your goals. It's common to view other people as being intrinsically valuable rather than instrumentally valuable. All right, so questions about what sorts of things are good or valuable, these kinds of questions, they're different from what we're going to call normative questions. Right, so normative is probably a new word for most of you. Normative just means having to do with should or ought. Right, so if we say it's a normative question, we're saying it's a question about what we ought to do, what we should do, or what we're obligated to do. Right? So in the study of ethics, there are sometimes claims made about what we should do, what we ought to do. There are also sometimes claims made about what it's okay for us to do, what it's permissible for us to do, or what we are obligated from a moral point of view to do. These are all normative questions. They're all questions about how we should or ought to be, or the ways that it's permissible for us to be, or ways it's obligatory for us to be. All right, so those are normative questions. When we ask normative questions, there are various senses in which the word should or ought might be used when we ask a question like, should I do this or that? And it's important to be very careful here and distinguish between these different senses of should or ought. Right, so we are going to distinguish between three different senses of should or ought. The first sense is going to be what we're going to call a legal sense. The second sense is what we're going to call a kind of social sense. And then the third sense is going to be what we call like the moral sense of should or ought. So it's very easy to show what the difference is between these different kinds of ought or should. Suppose I say something like you shouldn't drive over the speed limit. That's a kind of legal sense of should. What I'm saying is if you do it, you're likely to get pulled over, get a ticket. You don't want to have to pay a fine or potentially go to jail. Um, so in the legal sense of should, you shouldn't drive over the speed limit because it would be breaking the law, right? It violates what's called a legal norm or a legal requirement, a legal obligation to drive under the speed limit. Right. Now, even though you'd be doing something illegal if you drove over the speed limit, there are various circumstances we could imagine where driving over the speed limit would be the right thing to do. Like, what if you need to get a friend who's just been shot to the hospital very quickly so that they don't die from bleeding? Right? Or maybe you have somebody in the car who's about to give birth and you want to get them to the hospital as quick as possible so that they have the baby in the hospital rather than in the car. Right? There might be circumstances where, from a kind of moral point of view, it seems morally okay to go over the speed limit. Right? So even though a behavior is illegal, you can still get a ticket for it. It doesn't necessarily make it wrong. Lots of other examples of this too. I mean, just think about, um, the fact that it's like illegal to smoke weed recreationally in the state of Texas. Does that mean that if somebody does it, they're doing something morally wrong? Right? Even though it's true that someone might say, well, like, you shouldn't do it here because it's illegal, that's not like a moral sense of should that we're talking about. It's not like somebody's going to be a bad person or they're doing something morally wrong if they like to get high on the weekends or something, at parties, whatever. All right, so just because something is illegal, it doesn't mean it's morally wrong. And just because something is legal, it doesn't mean that it's morally right. We can think of many examples of things that are legal that are morally wrong. Right? Just think about something like lying to a close friend or family member for no good reason, right? Or maybe cheating on a romantic partner who's loving and faithful, and you've agreed to be monogamous with them, so you're not going to sleep around with other people. In other words, these behaviors would be wrong, lying and cheating in this case, even though they're totally legal. It's not like you're going to get a ticket or sent to prison for doing these things. Right? So this is a very crucial distinction to draw between what the law says and then what is actually right and wrong. All right, so now let's talk about the social sense of should. So let's say that a social norm is any kind of way in which it's socially acceptable to behave. So these clearly vary across cultures and times and places. What counts as socially normal in one part of the world might count as socially abnormal in a different part of the world, or what counts as socially normal at one point in history might count as socially abnormal at a different point in history. And when we're talking about social norms, we're talking about things that they're not moral issues. Right? So think about like the way people eat, or the way people dress, or whether they have tattoos on their bodies. It's kind of like if you decide to get a tattoo, no big deal. It's not a moral obligation that you get a tattoo. It's also not morally wrong if you get one. Or if you decide to eat your food with forks and spoons and knives rather than with your hands, that's not a moral issue, even though in different parts of the world, sometimes people eat basically everything with just their hands. Yet there are cultural differences here, and there's no moral issue. Right? Same goes for things like holding the door for the person behind you. In some cultures, that's like a socially acceptable thing to do. In other cultures, people just don't do that sort of thing. Right? And it's not like it's right or wrong to be one way or another. Now, what's crucial to see here is that even though there are cultural differences when it comes to these socially acceptable ways of behaving, it doesn't mean that morality or rightness and wrongness must therefore be dependent on culture in any way. Now, just because in one culture it's okay to eat your food with your hands, and in another culture you're supposed to use forks and spoons and knives, and there's no fact of the matter regarding who's right or who's wrong in this case, it doesn't mean that it's like, sometimes okay to oppress entire groups of people on the basis of their race or their gender just because most people in a culture think that it is. Right? Or it doesn't mean that that murder is justified in certain cultures just because most people think that the murder is justified, right? There's what's socially acceptable, that's one thing, and then there's what's right and wrong. That's a different thing, right? So what's legal and illegal is different from what's right and wrong, and then what's socially acceptable or not socially acceptable is different from what's right and what's wrong. All right, there's a quote here from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on this slide, and it really points to this difference between these three different senses of should and ought. So Dr. King says, there comes a time when one must take the position that's neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. This is from Dr. King's Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution speech in 1968. All right, and you can see there that there is a distinction drawn between what's safe, what's politic, and what's popular, right? Or what's in my own best interest to do, that would make it safe for me. What's politic, what's legal versus illegal, and then what's popular, what's socially acceptable for me to do, right? So this statement here, this quote from Dr. King, points to some more examples for us to consider. So think about examples from the civil rights era where people openly violated segregation law in the South. For instance, sometimes there were sit-ins staged at restaurants where even though people of color weren't supposed to be eating in whites-only restaurants, they'd stage a sit-in there and go in there anyways, right? Or people of color weren't supposed to sit in a certain area of the bus, and that was violated, right? Openly violated. People knowingly broke that law to protest it, right? These are acts of what we commonly call civil disobedience. Right? Now it seems totally noble to do this sort of thing, right? To do something knowingly that's illegal to do because you are protesting the unjust law that tells you you can't do it. Right? So this is another example where something is illegal to do, but the law is unjust, and so it's not like the law is telling you something that you, morally speaking, must do. All right, when it comes to the moral sense of should or ought, we tend to think that that's the most important sense of should or ought. And so the last phrase here on this slide, it says the dominance of moral norms. All that refers to is the idea that in any case where there's a conflict between, say, what's morally the case and then what the law says or what people think is acceptable or unacceptable, that morality wins out. Morality sort of wins the day, right? So even if something's illegal, even if something is socially unpopular, if morally speaking it's the right thing to do, then I ought to do it. That's what the dominance of moral norms means. Moral standards or norms dominate standards of law and standards set by what is determined to be socially acceptable or unacceptable. All right, so it's super important to keep conceptually distinct these differences between what's morally right and wrong, what the law says, and then what's socially acceptable or unacceptable. All right, so appreciating those distinctions can help us to see better what it is that we're talking about in this class. Where what we're talking about is morality rather than these other things, law, what's socially popular. All right, another way into seeing what our subject matter is or topic is in this course is by thinking about these elements of ethics that we get in chapter 1. So the first is called the preeminence of reason. What is that? It's a very basic idea. And the idea is that if we're going to think something is right or wrong, so we make a moral judgment, then our judgment has to be supported by good reasons. Right? So in other words, in the domain of morality, when we think about ethics, reason is to be our guide. Reason can help us see our way forward. Right? And you might ask, well, rather than what? Reason rather than what? Well, rather than things like maybe emotions or feelings. So, for example, just because I feel like something's wrong, that doesn't make it wrong. Right? If I judge that an action is wrong, then I better have good reasons to think that it's wrong. I can't just have a feeling that it's wrong. Right? So we're going to try our best in this class to set aside our own feelings or emotions or biases and just focus on what there's most reason to think about right and wrong. All right, so that would be to apply the preeminence of reason. The second element of ethics is called the principle of universalizability. And all this means is that if a moral standard or a moral rule or principle applies in one situation, then it also applies in all other situations that are relevantly similar. Right? So take a moral rule like don't steal. If it's wrong for me to break into your home and take your TV, then it's also wrong for you to do that to someone else. Right? So you, me, anybody else, none of us are exceptions to uh, the moral rules. Right? These are things that everybody must follow, and they apply in a way that's consistent across all relevantly similar situations. Now, of course, sometimes there are like good reasons to think that a moral rule applies in one situation but doesn't apply in the same way in another situation. So, for instance, suppose I want to feed the hungry and I want to be charitable, and I decide I'm going to go to HEB and get some fixins for sandwiches, and then I'm going to take them down, under a local bridge where I know some homeless hang out, and I'm going to pass around these sandwiches and help feed people this afternoon. If I do that, I'm doing something nice, right? I'm being kind. Suppose while I'm on my way there with the sandwiches, I run into Elon Musk and he asks me what I'm doing, and I tell him, and he says, "Well, could I have a sandwich, please?" And I say, "No, go to Subway and get your own sandwich." Uh, Me saying that would not be a violation of this principle of universalizability, right? Because in this case, I have a good reason to be charitable with the homeless without necessarily needing to give a sandwich to Elon Musk. After all, he can afford his own sandwich, whereas these people that I intend to feed can't. Right? So this is a situation where things are not relevantly similar. Right? This is a situation where I'm giving a sandwich to somebody who's homeless, and then a situation where I'm giving a sandwich to Elon Musk. They're not relevantly similar in a way that would demand me giving a sandwich to Elon Musk too. Right? So this is just a kind of long-winded way of saying it's important to think about the specific context of a situation. Right? There might be a good reason to think that a moral standard that applies in pretty much every other situation like this might not apply in this particular situation because there's a relevant difference maker. Okay. All right. The third principle is called the principle of impartiality. And this one just says, from the moral point of view, all persons are considered equal and should be treated accordingly. It's really important for me to stress that this claim behind the principle of impartiality, it's not the claim that we're all equal in ability. Right? That's not the sense of equality we're talking about. We're not saying everybody can do the same things or everyone is equally able to do the same things or everyone has the same talents or skills or abilities. We're just saying that from the moral point of view, we all matter equally. Right? So it's not the case that like one person would matter more than another from an ethical point of view. Right? Another thing I should say here, we're not saying that this equality principle means that some people aren't more useful to society than other people. For instance, there's a sense in which maybe the president of the United States matters more than me to society because for whatever reason, a lot more hangs on their decisions and what they do with their life than what I do with mine. right, when it comes to society at large. That doesn't mean that the president matters more from an ethical point of view. It would be equally tragic from a moral point of view for a bad thing to happen to one person as it would to happen to a totally different person. Right? We're all equal in that sense. All right, so one thing you may be thinking at this point, maybe you have been thinking it since I first started a few slides ago, is, well, when it comes to what's right and what's wrong, isn't it all like totally subjective? Doesn't it all depend on the person? Or doesn't it all depend on where you were raised, or how you were raised, or in what culture you were brought up? And we're going to get into this issue of where morality comes from and whether it's all subjective in the second chapter. But let me just say, as a kind of preliminary point, there's a difference between thinking that something is true and then that thing actually being true. Right? If I think something is true, suppose I have this belief that that something's wrong, doesn't mean that it necessarily is. Right? The belief is this thing inside of my head, and presumably the belief is supposed to be true, but it might not be true. Right? Just because I think it's true doesn't make it true. Right? We know where our moral beliefs come from. Right? Children are raised to think certain things are right and other things are wrong. And so, of course, beliefs about right and wrong vary across times and places and cultures and whatnot. Right? People used to think that slavery was okay in the American South. People were raised to think that. That's how, ideologies like racism work. Right? People get raised to believe certain things, and then they believe them. Right? That doesn't mean that what they believe is true, though. Right? Just because I was raised to think something is true doesn't make it true. Right? So there are two different questions we could ask at this point. The first is, where do my moral beliefs come from? Where do my morals come from? And then the second question, are my moral beliefs true? Now notice the first question, where do my moral beliefs come from? That is a descriptive ethics question. It's a question about what people actually think. Right? And we are not going to be doing any kind of science or psychology of what people think in this class. We're not interested in that in this class. We're interested in what's right and what's wrong. Right? We're not so much interested in what people think is right and wrong. Right? So we're rather interested in the second kind of question, like, is this or that moral judgment that somebody could make or moral belief that somebody could have, is it true? And what are the reasons for thinking that might be true or might be false? Right? So we're focused not on like the fact that people think certain things in this class, but we're focused on like what those thoughts are about, namely rightness and wrongness, and specific actions or activities that might be thought to be right or wrong. We're going to be asking, are they really? So the first kind of question, where do my moral beliefs come from? Relatively, uninteresting. Right? We know where they come from. They come from our time and place. They're heavily influenced by things like religion, culture, society, family. But what about morality itself? Rightness and wrongness themselves. Are they influenced by religion, culture, society, family? Not so obvious. All right. Now, why ask this question in the first place? Why wonder, are my moral beliefs true? Right? Why ever be kind of skeptical? Why take a skeptical attitude towards your own morals? Well, here's one reason to do it. If you never do it, then you are just a product of your time and place. Right? Had you been born in a different society or in a different culture, raised to believe different things, then you would have had a different set of morals. Right? So they're not really yours. They're not really yours if they're just a product of your time and place. Whereas if you stop to ask yourself the question, do I really think this? Right? I was raised to think incest is wrong, but is it really wrong? Right? And you try to make up your mind for yourself, then you can take some ownership over your beliefs. Okay? Asking yourself the question, are my morals true? It's a way of getting yourself into a frame of mind where you're going to take a stand for yourself on the issue. Right? You're going to make up your mind for yourself. And so what can this do for you? It can give you some free will over your own mind. It can make it the case that your thinking is not just the product of your time and place. You've made a deliberate decision to take the skeptical attitude towards your own morals and think for yourself, to try to apply your own ability to reason and think critically about your morals to discover whether or not you actually endorse them. All right, so let's consider one application of our ability to reason and think critically about right and wrong. And so we'll think about this ethical theory that's called divine command theory. This is our last slide in this chapter. Right, divine command theory says that rightness and wrongness come from God. Right? So the more specific idea is what you see here on the slide. Moral truths are determined by God's commands. So if God tells us to do X, then we must do X from a moral point of view. If we don't do X, then we're behaving wrongly. If God says don't do X, then we, morally speaking, are obliged to not do X. And then if God doesn't say anything about it, then do it if you want to, but it's kind of morally neutral. Morally speaking, it just doesn't matter. All right, this is a view called divine command theory. Lots of people throughout history have accepted this view or something like it. Is it true, though? Right, so we're not interested here in whether people think it's true. We're interested in the question, is it true? All right, so if we ask that question, is it true, then we can apply reason and critical thinking to divine command theory. And so that's what we're going to do. All right, so in the history of ethics, a very famous theoretical problem was noticed for divine command theory by an ancient Greek philosopher named Plato. Right, so Plato has this problem for the divine command theory that's today called the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma begins with the asking of a question. Right, and here's the question. Is an action morally right because God commands it to be so, or does God command it to be so because it's morally right? All right, so why does this question matter? Well, notice that there are two possibilities here. The first possibility is that an action is right because God commands it. Right because God commands it. Right? So if that's true, then anything God commanded would be right. Right? Even if God commanded horrible things like rape or murder or torture, those things would be right. If it's the case, then an action's right because God commands it. This seems to imply that morality is totally arbitrary. Anything at all could be right or wrong. You would just need God to command it. Now, that seems quite extraordinary, quite unbelievable of moral rightness and wrongness. How could a horrible action like rape or murder or torture be right just because an all-powerful being commands it? You might even think, well, isn't God supposed to be all good? Like, God would never command us to do these horrible things. There are constraints on what God could command us to do or not do, given God's all good nature. Right? If you're thinking either of those things, then you're thinking that it's not true that an action's right because God commands it. At best, maybe God commands an action because it's right. Right? God commands us to not rape or murder or torture one another because those things are wrong. All right, so this is the other possibility, the other possible way in which the divine commands could be related to facts about what's right and what's wrong. All right, so the second possibility, according to this second one, the idea is that God commands an action because it's right. All right, now, if that's true, then it follows that something else aside from the divine commands determines what's right and what's wrong. Right? So if the divine command is based on some independent fact about what's right and what's wrong, then it's not the command itself that makes the action right or wrong. Right? So another way to see the basic problem here for divine command theory is to see that when it comes to God's relation to morality, God could either be what's called a truth recognizer of morality, so God could recognize the truth about what's right and what's wrong. Another thing that God could be, though, is a truth maker for morality. Right? God could make certain moral actions right or wrong just by commanding us to do them or not do them. Right, so this is a very important distinction between recognizing that something is true and then making something true. I can recognize that it's sunny in San Marcos today. I'm not making it sunny though. Right? So take the claim, it's sunny in San Marcos today. I recognize the truth of that statement or claim, but I'm not making it true. Now I do make certain claims true, like the fact that there is an assignment in this class due on such and such date. That's a fact that I make true, right? Because I could get rid of the assignment. I could make it false, right? I'm in charge of giving the assignments and whatnot. Right? So each of us is capable of making certain things true, but we're, of course, not capable of making anything true. So the question raised by the Euthyphro dilemma is, does God just recognize the truth of what's right and what's wrong? Or does God make truths about what's right and wrong true? Right? So is God a truth recognizer of morality or a truth maker for morality? And what the Euthyphro dilemma shows is that if God is a truth maker for morality, then morality is totally arbitrary. Anything at all could be right or wrong. You just need God to command it to be so. Right? So that seems to be a worry for divine command theory. It doesn't seem like morality is just this totally arbitrary thing. It seems like there are reasons for thinking that some actions are right and other things are wrong. Now, on the other hand, if God's just a truth recognizer of morality, then it follows that facts about right and wrong are independent of the divine commands. And so it's not the divine commands that make things right or wrong. Right? What Plato's Euthyphro dilemma seems to show is that divine command theory fails as an explanation of rightness and wrongness, moral rightness and wrongness. Right? It doesn't serve as an adequate explanation. Right? So we're going to talk about other examples of ethical theories. This is divine command theory is an example of an ethical theory, and it's just one example, but we're going to look at lots of examples in this class. There are other possible explanations that could be given for what makes anything right or wrong. So for instance, according to some theories, something is wrong just in case it harms somebody else. Or something is the right thing to do just in case it brings about the most happiness in the world and the least amount of suffering. That's another kind of potential explanation for what makes something right or wrong. Right? That's a different kind of explanation from divine command theory. Right? So one goal in this class is to be thinking about, well, why is anything right or wrong? And to apply reason and critical thinking to that sort of question. And to really just like try and gain a better understanding of morality and perhaps get closer to the truth regarding various questions that come up in the study of ethics.